Less than 100 years ago, the British ruled a quarter of the globe and 1 in 5 of the global population. The British Empire was the biggest there's ever been. And even though it's long gone, its powerful legacy remains.
It used to be the case that people were happy, proud even, to declare themselves imperialists. But now, across great swathes of the world, that sounds like a badge of shame.
In this film, I'm going to examine not whether the empire was a force for good or for ill, but instead how it's been portrayed on television over the past 60 years. Using the history series Time Watch and other gems from the BBC archive, I'll discover how filmmakers have altered their perspective over succeeding decades. I'll span the globe, like the empire itself. I'll see how Britain's Caribbean colonies grew rich on slave labour.
Slaves were expendable. The life expectancy of a slave was 7 years.
How chaos gripped India when independence came.
Britain, the once great colonial power, looks on as India burns.
How Africa was plundered for her mineral wealth.
Millions of pounds worth of diamonds represented not money, but power.
They called it the empire upon which the sun never set.
Though it's now gone, the arguments, the divisions over the British Empire are very far from being settled. Oxford is where many of the masters of empire came for their education. The colonial officials, the district officers, the viceroys even. But one Oxford graduate left his mark on the empire in a way that overshadowed almost all others. He's a figure who provokes bitter controversy more than a century after his death.
So there he is, Cecil Rhodes, the man who had the audacity, the arrogance not just to seize countries, but to even have one named after himself.
It's his statue, here at Oriel College, which some say recalls the very worst side of the empire. And because of that, he has no right to remain.
They say Rhodes must fall.
So let's look first at some of these empire builders. The actor and historian Kenneth Griffith was one of the first to take on Cecil Rhodes more than 40 years ago.
Oxford University, England. He wanted to take a degree at University College.
The master wouldn't wear it, but introduced him to the Provost of Oriel, saying, "They're less particular there."
The Provost of Oriel received him glumly, saying, "All the colleges send me their failures."
What stops the laugh before it has started is that this young man ended his short life with 850,000 square miles of the Earth's surface in his own name.
Rhodes named his conquest Rhodesia, now the country of Zimbabwe.
Cecil Rhodes is a good poster boy for these kinds of debates about empire, good or bad. I mean, particularly because he was just one of those figures who was a colossus in terms of British imperial expansion and debates about the nature of British imperialism at the time and, of course, ever since as well.
The conquered land had belonged to the Matabele tribe, under their king Lobengula. But spears were no match for machine guns and artillery.
The British opened up with their field guns, and the best of Lobengula's warriors were no more. One regiment, the Mbesiu, lost 500 of its 700 men. A witness to this carnage was Rhodes's young friend Willoughby, who recorded the so-called battle rather sportingly. He wrote, "The Mbesiu and Ngubu regiments were practically annihilated. I cannot speak too highly of the pluck of these two regiments. I believe that no civilized troops could have withstood the terrific fire they did for at most half as long.
Bear in mind that this film appeared in 1971, when a guerrilla war was raging between African nationalists, including descendants of the Matabele, and descendants of the white settlers, in a country which didn't abandon the name Rhodesia until 1980. Rhodes seemed to epitomize the worst of the power-hungry imperialists come to strip Africa of her wealth.
Money, money, money is ever the key to Rhodes's power. And in the year 1886, at a place that was to be named Johannesburg, the biggest so loved young Pickering that in 1882 he left him his entire vast fortune. The will simply reads, I, C.J. Rhodes, leave my worldly wealth to N.E. Pickering. And at that very time, Rhodes was informed that Neville Pickering was mortally ill in Kimberley. Rhodes, to his eternal credit, turned his back on his gold options and fled to Pickering's bedside. Rhodes personally nursed and cherished young Pickering, while other money grubbers grabbed the gold.
Astonished and discomforted many. He played company off against company until finally he took the jackpot. He was a multimillionaire by the time he was 35. But diamonds as jewelry, as adornments for royal crowns or women, did not interest him, any more than women did. For him, the millions of pounds worth of diamonds that passed through De Beers sorting rooms represented not money, but power. Rhodes restated the imperial creed.
I contend that we are the first race in the world. And the more of the world we inhabit, the better. Every acre added to our territory provides for the birth of more of the English race. I have viewed the people of the world and have come to the conclusion that the English-speaking race has the highest ideal of justice, liberty and peace. Therefore, I shall devote the rest of my life to advancing the English, the greatest people the world has ever seen.
In the post-imperial early 1970s, with Britain's economy on the slide, Rhodes's racist creed seemed particularly out of place to many historians.
Preoccupations of the time affect history. Every historian is completely influenced by his or her time. In the 60s and 70s, we might be interested in Marxism. Obviously, there's a Cold War going on. And so you have a Marxist interpretation of empire.
It's inevitable that in the historiography of something as vast as the British Empire, there are going to be different generations of historical approach and interpretation and vicious debates within each generation.
But it would be wrong to think that the failings of these giant characters, like Cecil Rhodes, only emerge long after they're gone. Controversy has always swirled around certain empire builders, as the BBC found in 1998 when it examined Earl Kitchener of Khartoum. Once the most famous face in the world, Kitchener, Britain's military chief in the First World War, played a controversial role a decade or so earlier in the South African Boer War.
His legendary organisational skills seem to have deserted him. He was nicknamed Kitchener of Chaos. His own troops were stricken with illness made worse by the harsh climate and Kitchener economising on medical care. British losses mounted and the guerrillas were still fighting.
Suddenly he was faced with a dreadful conundrum. Here was an enemy which would not get into the field and fight him in a pitched battle. It was a hidden enemy, and so he had to flush it out.
Kitchener needed to starve the guerrillas of all supplies. Farms, crops and livestock were burnt by British troops. Boer women and children were evicted from their land and sent to makeshift concentration camps. By the end of the war, at least 26,000 women and children had died from hunger and disease.
It caused appalling suffering, which was quite unnecessary. He didn't need to deny proper supplies and medical arrangements for women and children. He just wasn't interested. This was just callous Kitchener.
He was not too fastidious about the means. He was very much like an engineer. I mean, he was trained as an engineer. And he took every problem he solved and took apart in the way that an engineer did, regardless of the consequences. So he thought, well, we need to isolate these communities, so we'll put them in internship camps. He didn't think of the humanity. That wasn't how his mind was structured.
Kitchener's concentration camps did come in for extensive criticism at the time, and lots of people felt the conduct of that war wasn't really acceptable. Of course, now the phrase concentration camps is so loaded for us by World War II that we have a kind of, an extra horror, perhaps.
As that film showed, almost 20 years ago, Kitchener's reputation is still in flux, a century after his death. I know from my own work that there is no such thing as a verdict of history. Just a fascinating but never-ending trial process, where we historians are always desperate to uncover new evidence.
And that's absolutely a driver, if you like, a motivating factor in historians' work. If you want to provoke and stimulate debate, there is an impetus to try and say something different, something slightly unusual, because you can't just keep saying the same thing.
Fortunately for us historians, the story of empire is dotted not only with giant, iconic characters, but also iconic milestone events, often ripe for revisionist analysis.
Time Watch followed this trend for debunking by tackling what some moviegoers would have considered one of the empire's finest hours.
In 2003, half a century after the movie Zulu appeared, Time Watch
resistance of the Zulu kingdom against white intervention.
Time War Bash, here at Rorke's Drift, is the story told in the film Zulu. The garrison held off their attackers for 10 hours and were awarded 11 Victoria Crosses. Though compared to the earlier catastrophe, it was a sideshow. Yet it was this action.
Elevating the strategic significance at Rorke's Drift wipes out some of the stain of the very real disaster.
Armed with spears, thrashing the technically superior British, ran counter to contemporary racist theorising. Jeremy Paxman explored that theme in 2012.
He looked at how some imperial
In 2012, such views, of course, sounded not just offensive, but ridiculous. It's hard to believe that even in the heyday of empire, ideas like that were taken seriously.
Let's not get too, with the benefit of hindsight, judgmental. But yes, I mean, there was social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. You've got genetic theories emerging. And there is scientific racism, definitely. You know, that's part of the mix, the intellectual mix. But there was certainly a sense in the air that, you know, the British were the top nation. If you look at the coverage of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, in American newspapers, there was one editorial which was saying, you know, we must acknowledge that the British are in charge of the world. They are the kingpins.
The movies and television have, I would argue, pretty much defined our image of the empire as it was in its Edwardian heyday.
It's those crazy bright red soldiers' uniforms and solar topies.
It's the world of ripping yarns, of carry on up the Khyber, of Corporal Jones and his fuzzy wuzzies who don't like it up 'em. In one sense, it's made the whole thing appear a bit comic.
That sort of humour is something that we relate to. The whole idea of sending up a figure in authority or someone who's quite self-important and is a big cheese, as it were, that's something that's quite British.
But as I've learnt on my trawl through the archives, there are some subjects that provoke argument, not laughter.
And Britain's record in India, the jewel in the imperial crown, is one of them. The BBC's 1972 series on the British Empire was one of the most ambitious history series ever made. This 13-hour analysis of the empire took 2.5 years to complete. It cost the then huge sum of £500,000 in an era when the Prime Minister was paid £20,000 a year. In one episode, filmmakers tell the story of the 1919 Amritsar massacre, a seminal event which hardened sentiment against British rule in India.
Amritsar, in the Punjab, the holy city of the Sikh religion. In 1919, it was to be the inappropriate setting for a historic moment of violence, which would detonate a prolonged struggle between the British Raj and Indian nationalists for control of India. The Punjab had always been one of the most loyal of provinces. It supplied over half the Indian Army's recruits, but in 1919 its cities were torn with rioting born of post-war discontents. There were attacks on Europeans and on government buildings. A town crier was sent round the city by General Dyer, the local British commander, to announce that all public assemblies were banned. A large crowd gathered in this park, the Jallianwala Bagh. on the 13th of April, 1919. General Dyer, with fewer than 100 troops, called on the crowd to disperse. It failed to do so. Unknown to Dyer, this narrow alley was the only exit from the Jallianwala Bagh. General Dyer said later, "I fired and continued to fire until the crowd dispersed. I consider this is the least amount of firing which would produce the necessary moral and widespread effect." 379 people were killed and 1,200 injured. The wife of the Assistant Commissioner recalls what happened after the shooting.
General Dyer came in looking very sad, and we gave him a drink. And then he said, "I'm for the high jump, but I've saved you women and children."
Swift retribution. That was how the Raj had always maintained its authority. But at home, the sentiment which prevailed was of horror and outrage. For post-war Britain was liberal, humanitarian in its climate of opinion. Dyer was disavowed by the government and sacked.
This story of the massacre recalls perhaps Britain's most shameful act during the Raj. And the filmmakers seem to underline that sense of shame once the Raj had ended in 1947.
This was once the mansion of Lord Clive, the first Governor-General of British India nearly 2 centuries before. The Honourable East India Company, the Empire of India, Governors-General, Viceroys, King-Emperors, all was over now. The British had said farewell at last, and India had returned to herself. Once these pillars had proclaimed a conqueror's pride, now they served to dry the hand-moulded cakes of cow dung, which are the staple Indian fuel. Eternal India's epitaph for an empire.
For some viewers, the film seemed to mock the very idea of empire. A former official of the Raj, Lord Ferrier, launched a debate in the House of Lords, which unleashed fierce criticism of the BBC.
In the official record, Hansard, there are pages and pages of complaints. The Lords, many of them quite elderly, turned out to be the most critical audience imaginable.
I was brought up in the Victorian era, when discipline, patriotism, and the establishment were all respected. Today, apparently, they're dirty words.
The BBC was compared to Lord Haw Haw, the radio propagandist for the Nazis during World War II.
We tend to think by 1972 the empire was over and that was, a new era in British politics. And of course, to some extent it was. But historical memory doesn't die immediately. A lot of the people who were objecting to this in the House of Lords and so on had lived through it, had worked in it. Many British families had spent not only their lifetimes but generations working in the empire. It was still a very live political issue for people at that time.
The irate politicians would have been astonished to learn what had been going on behind closed doors at the BBC.
The series almost didn't make it to the screen. The rows backstage, inside the BBC, about what to say about the empire were the same as those raging outside among historians and politicians.
According to one of the producers on the series, then in his 30s, the BBC wanted to glorify and celebrate the empire.
But the young producers were having none of it. They even talked about resigning en masse before they got their way, to tell the story warts and all.
The empire is still an incredibly political thing to discuss because its echoes are still with us so strongly. It still affects so much of the world today, certainly if we're talking about, say, the Middle East, which is in that history. So it is still incredibly political for many people.
More than a quarter century after that row over the Empire series, India was still a controversial topic. In 1998, Time Watch invited one of our best-known historians to argue the case.
Andrew Roberts highlights what he believes to be historical myths of British rule in India.
Of all the enduring achievements of the British in India, this railway system was one of the greatest.
I'm startled that he could have made a film saying some of the things that are in there.
Does it disturb you at all that Hitler admired what the British had done in India and in fact used it?
India seemed to be falling apart.
The task of managing the handover had been given to Earl Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, and he was in a hurry to get the job done.
At a press conference, Mountbatten dropped a bombshell. Britain would not be leaving in June 1948, as had been planned, but on August 15th, 1947, just 3 months away.
The whole problem was that Mountbatten tried to do this job in too short a time. To expect a country to be partitioned, a new country to be created, and within 2 months, everything went out of control.
It was no question of it being too soon. It was much too late. Because in fact, when he arrived, he saw the situation was so much more volcanic than he'd been led to believe in England.
Communities that have lived together for centuries turn on each other in one of the worst communal massacres of the 20th century. Britain, the once great colonial power, looks on as India burns.
Hindus and Muslims were in the grip of madness, lunacy.
India and Pakistan.
There was very much at the time, and certainly looking back, a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. There were some senior British politicians in government who would have liked to have stayed for another 15 years to make the handover more successful. But of course, nationalist politicians, quite rightly, want the power now.
A story revived to meet a significant anniversary. Yet even then, they serve a valuable purpose in outlining the key moments of history for a new generation. I've seen how the imperial legacy in Africa and India has been the subject of often controversial filmmaking for many decades. Cecil Rhodes appears to have few defenders, while the motives of the Masters of the Raj were mixed, and that's borne out in the television archive. But in another part of the empire, the motive of the Masters was quite clear, and their methods despicable. An episode of the 1972 British Empire series looked at how for 200 years Britain drew riches from the Caribbean, using enslaved Africans.
It took 3 years to break an African tribesman into an efficient field slave. It was known as the seasoning period. 1 in 3 of the slaves died during seasoning, of disease, overwork, ill treatment, and suicide. They worked from dawn to dusk, with a short break for breakfast and a longer one at midday. Though the work in stifling cane fields was back-breaking, crop time seemed the best in the year to the slaves. Then at least they could stave off hunger by chewing cane, and they were even given rum to keep them going. Slaves were expendable. The planters reckoned it more economic to import new slaves from Africa rather than prolong the life of those they had by better treatment. The life expectancy of a slave was 7 years.
Eventually, after decades of campaigning, the abolitionists won their moral crusade against slavery.
In 1833, the reformed House of Commons decreed the end of slavery in the British colonies. In the West Indies, 500,000 slaves rejoiced on the great day.
In 1972, filmmakers largely accepted that the slaves were freed on moral grounds. Since then, some historians have suggested that slave rebellions and cold economics also played a role.
Industrialization is far more productive than having slave labor. It's not a humanitarian thing. People work out that slave labor actually isn't that productive. You've got to feed them, you've got to look after them when they get sick, you've got to house them. And actually the industrial system, if you like, where you pay people and then they look after themselves in theory or are not looked after, was far more productive and profitable.
The film appeared in the early 1970s, at a time when Britain's relationship with its former colonies was hotly debated. Although the sun had finally set on the empire, there remained the legacy of those imperial citizens who claimed their rights to settle in Britain, which many regarded as the mother country.
Immigration was the big issue, and filmmakers in the 1970s began to ask whether high levels of immigration were desirable, and also if those who came were getting a fair deal.
There have been blacks in Liverpool since the 1770s, a consequence of the shipping trade with West Africa. In those days, black slaves could be bought in Liverpool. Later, African seamen settled here, and then in the 1940s, the wartime government recruited West Indians to work in British factories. For generations, these black men have married and lived with white women, producing a half-caste community that is British by birth and Afro-British by race. What's life like in this estate?
It's all right, you know. I've got friends with the woman next door to me. Well, they're all friendly in the neighbourhoods. But the woman next door is very friendly, you know.
Is she white?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's white.
But locally born Liverpool blacks want more than neighbourly tolerance. They want equality of opportunity, a fair share of whatever jobs this depressed area has to offer. According to race relations workers here, many Liverpool employers have discriminated against the black community for so many years that the practice has become an accepted fact of life. Even in its better days, Liverpool has always had twice the national rate of unemployment, and always the blacks have found themselves at the end of the queue.
There's got to be a policy of positive discrimination. They've got to come forward and they've got to allocate jobs to black people. They've got to recognise that black people exist and black people need to be catered for. Kids 17, 18, 19, they have a right to say, what is this white society doing for me?
Filmmakers were keen to explain, in the simplest terms, the new law to protect the rights of immigrants, which had just come into effect.
It's an attempt to change people's attitudes. Take employment first. This man is after a job for which he's qualified and which he knows exists because he's seen it advertised. He applies for the job, but the employer turns him down. That rejection could be against the new law. An employer may not refuse a man a job or deny him promotion or pay him less simply on grounds of race. The same man is now looking for somewhere to live. He goes to a boarding house and he asks for a room. If the owner turns him down, apparently on grounds of race, he can take the owner to court. The law applies to hotels. Indeed, it's now unlawful to deny a person any goods or service on racial grounds.
Whatever the law said, not all of the recent arrivals felt welcome in Britain.
It's now 25 years since Commonwealth Asians first came to Britain in sizable numbers. At first, the men came alone, uncertain whether they'd stay. But later, most of them sent for their wives and transplanted their roots and their culture. And now there's a second generation of British Asians that knows no country but this.
The British don't accept me because they say, although you possess a British passport, and although I have lived all of my life, almost all of my life in this country, they will not accept me.
We are stuck, in a sense, between the two cultures, the Western and our own culture.
The old Jewish quarter of Whitechapel, now occupied by one of the least favoured immigrant groups in Britain, the Bengalis of Bangladesh. The parts of Bangladesh they come from are among the poorest in the world. They face bigger problems of adjustment to British society than any other immigrant group. The result is tension and sometimes violence.
The window has been broken and one upstairs. When they threw the bricks, the glass went everywhere in the room, and the baby was sleeping in the cot, and baby had bruise in the face, marked.
Two men my back in the top, and one is putting the knife in cut this and that way.
In 1994, using newly released official papers, Time Watch explored the history of immigration from the former empire. In an episode which resonates today, politicians apparently underestimated how many people would take the opportunity to settle in Britain, causing concern in some communities.
By the early 1960s, some of those who lived in the communities where the black immigrants had settled felt emboldened to speak their mind.
Well, it's no good for folks saying as people will mix, they just won't.
They're a nuisance at work, they won't work. And for folks who got them living by them, they're a more nuisance still.
I think they should live in a district all to themselves, because I've got to bring this little boy up amongst them.
The problem arose from a miscalculation made in the late 1940s.
British subjects numbered nearly 800 million people. From whichever country they came, they had the right to work and settle in Britain, a right enshrined in the British Nationality Act of 1948. It was assumed that only a few of those subjects would actually exercise their right. But with the passing of the new act, the children of the empire began to come home. Leaving behind poverty and unemployment, they were hoping for a better tomorrow in Britain.
Time Watch revealed how quickly the policy of open-door immigration was called into question and how the whole subject became mired in politics.
Official documents that have recently been the subject of academic study reveal that within months of enacting the 1948 Act, the authorities were already alarmed by its implications. In April 1954, a meeting was convened to build a case for legislation intended to withdraw the automatic right of abode in the 1948 Act. In November 1961, amidst heated debate, the government introduced a bill to limit immigration from the old empire.
Despite those first measures to control immigration more than 50 years ago, the subject remains very much alive. As recently as 2012, filmmakers were able to demonstrate just how firmly shut the once open door has now become. The children of those who would once have claimed an entitlement to enter Britain face a treacherous journey and a cold reception.
Illegal migrants from India trapped in the UK without a home, work, or even an identity.
They pay people smugglers thousands of pounds, yet sometimes end up penniless and destitute.
Punjab, one of India's richest states. They call it the food basket of India. In the first decades after independence, hundreds of thousands of mainly Sikh Punjabis settled in the UK to fill huge gaps in Britain's workforce. Today, the criteria they must meet for a British work visa is much tougher. Agents charge up to $15,000 for a visa and the services of traffickers. There are no refunds. This is Southall in West London. It's home to a huge South Asian population, one of the biggest concentrations outside India. Over the last 20 years, illegal immigrants from India have added to that population. But for new arrivals, life here is tough. From sunrise, hundreds of illegal immigrants descend on the train station car park, a regular pickup point for cheap, illegal labour. A lack of work is pushing illegal workers into the very poverty they hope to escape. They live here, in Britain's 21st century slums. Across Southall, 2,500 poorly constructed buildings, hidden at the end of suburban gardens. They call them sheds with beds. Many built without planning permission, others converted garages.
This is just one street, and on the end of each garden there are brick buildings like this one, all with windows and doorways leading to this alleyway, and they just go on and on and on.
Increasing numbers of illegal immigrants are giving up on their life in Britain. But getting home isn't easy.
Of course, many millions of Commonwealth citizens have come to Britain and thrived here. The nation that 70 years ago offered an open door to all its former subjects is no longer so welcome.
The world we live in today is a consequence of empire. My parents were from Ghana, or the Gold Coast as it then was. They wanted to continue their education in what was even then called the mother country, the kind of seat of empire, if you like. I mean, I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for the British Empire.
Delving into the Empire archive has reminded me of one important principle. History can never be entirely objective. Historians and filmmakers must select which facts to work with, how to interpret them, and therefore the message they convey.
There is a particularly robust debate in Britain about empire and about our supposed heroes or villains of our history. Now there's actually a great fashion for people saying it wasn't that bad after all. That's been going for some time, and then there's a counterbalance to that. But I think this is all part of a healthy debate. You wouldn't want to restrict what points of view people were allowed to take.
I've seen how, in the 1970s, filmmakers were keen to expose the excesses of empire, giving empire builders the credit for a noble enterprise.
The languages together.
The film recognises that those noble aims were only partially achieved by the time Britain decided to call it a day.
In 1947, where they were interned like so many forlorn hostages to that old joker, history. But perhaps the last word on the British Empire hasn't been written after all. At least if that empire is thought of not in terms of scarlet tunics and flashing sabres, but language, law, and liberal democracy.
filmmakers were accused of treason, more or less, in their judgment on India. This 2002 judgment seems far more charitable. But, as always, there will be a voice to challenge each new interpretation.
Even today, I think there's very much a desire in a country like Britain not to be told that key aspects of our past were desperately iniquitous. People want to believe that generally it was all okay, even if some nasty things happened. Well, unfortunately, when you begin to look at the very underpinnings of British imperialism, the underpinnings were often remarkably suspect. So even if some more benign things happened at certain junctures, that really isn't the bit of the story that necessarily should be focused upon. A more rounded story is needed, and I think the tail should never be allowed to wag the dog.
In 2012, Jeremy Paxman cast his critical eye over the empire and wrapped up his inquiry by urging that we re-engage with the... As I've gone through the archive, I've seen historians being attacked by their peers. I've seen filmmakers pilloried in the House of Lords. Wouldn't it be wiser just to steer clear of the empire and stay out of trouble?
Quite simply, it's so full of such astonishing stories that it's a constant source of material for documentary filmmakers as well as dramatists and screenwriters.
And when the pendulum of historical interpretation swings so violently, it means that familiar subjects never lose their appeal.
Ironically, it's now almost as controversial to defend characters like Cecil Rhodes as it was 4 decades ago to denounce them.
It seems to me that the documentary archive demonstrates that there's no historical subject more exciting and colourful, nor more treacherous and controversial than the British Empire. And if it gets people thinking and caring passionately about who we are and where we've come from, is that a bad thing?
At least one wedding in the offing next. It's the final part of our classic drama, Pride and Prejudice, coming up on BBC4.